Hello from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. I am CGTN's Guan. Now we are covering the returns of 10 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers who died during the Korean War, and the ceremony will kickstart at 11 a.m. this morning Beijing time. Now look around us, we can see that a convoy of soldiers, they are preparing for the marching event, as well as they will be transferring the coffins to the buses after the plane landed. And the plane from South Korea has already departed about 1 hour ago. They should be here in just less than 10 minutes. And we were told that there will be 2 fighter jets escorting the plane, carrying the remains of the Chinese volunteer soldiers once the plane entered China's airspace. So this will be the highest honor given by the People's Liberation Army once it entered China's territory. After landing, these soldiers, they will be marching in a formation. We can see the military band, as well as they are the convoy from the PLA. They will be walking into the plane and then took down the coffins, which will be covered by China's national flag. And also now over here we can see there have been over 100 medias from all over the country. They've been waiting here since early this morning, and some of them are from the internet, others from the newspapers, some from the country's media, also some from the local television bureau. And also CCTV is going to do a full coverage on the return of these 10 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers. Now we can see this the television remote truck from the provincial television bureau. There will be a big live coverage on the returns of the 10 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers. Now, speaking of this yearly event, China and South Korea have reached the agreement back in 2013 that the remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers will be returned on a yearly basis just before the Tomb Sweeping Festival. Up until now, about 589 sets of remains have been returned, and today there will be another 10 sets of remains, so that makes it 599 sets of remains in total. Now, we have been to the Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang, where all these remains were buried, and met with some veterans there, and they were paying tributes to their comrades in arms. And let's take a listen. Paying tribute to the fallen soldiers, 88-year-old Ma Shixun, who survived the Korean War, says he will never forget the sacrifices that his comrades in arms made. He joined the Chinese Volunteer Army in 1951 and served in the logistics department, one of the hottest targets of the enemy's aerial bombing.
Are you all sure of what you are signing up for? Think twice. My instructor asked us at the recruitment. I almost lost my life after one bombing because the fire couldn't be put out in our unit.
As part of the consensus reached by China and South Korea in 2013, remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers who served in the Korean War will be returned to China on a yearly basis. So far, 589 sets have come in. They include everything from shoes and stamps to skeletal remains. They've all been buried here in Shenyang.
Though the war ended 66 years ago, for today's soldiers we must never forget the sacrifices of those who died, and to treat them as spiritual role models.
More than 190,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers died during the Korean War, but very few of them were buried in China. the hard-won peace they died for will never be forgotten.
Since 1993, I have come to the cemetery on my own every year, just before Tomb Sweeping Festival. At first, it was spontaneous. Nowadays, though, there are fewer and fewer living veterans, so we come to pay respects in groups.
After the previous return last year, the newly formed Ministry of Veteran Affairs, following the structural reform of China's State Council, is taking charge of the settlement of the remains for the Chinese volunteer soldiers.
10 sets of remains will be returned on this Wednesday, but their identities are still unknown. After the burial service, we will work on the establishment of digital archives for the remains returned.
So far, only 24 sets of the 589 returned have been identified. As for the rest, veterans like Ma Shixun can only regard them as their comrades in arms. Guan, CGTN, Shenyang. More than 2.4 million Chinese volunteer armies were sent to the DPRK during the Korean War, and the latest statistics show that nearly 20,000 soldiers died in the Korean Peninsula, but very few of them were actually buried in China. Now, this according to people who devote more than 3 decades of work in a museum in Dandong, that he said about 2 or 3%, only 2 or 3% of the volunteer soldiers were actually buried in China. Most of them were scattered. The graves were scattered across the Korean Peninsula, including Mao Ai-ying, the son of Chairman Mao. He was buried on the Korean Peninsula. Now, for people who have fought alongside these volunteer soldiers, this flight from South Korea today could be the flight they've been waiting for more than 6 decades. We know the armistice agreement was signed in 1953, so it's been 66 years since the armistice. And also look around us, obviously we are just less than 3 minutes. The plane carrying the remains is scheduled to land at 11 o'clock this morning. It should travel from that direction. So now we're just waiting for this big moment. You will see the plane will be escorted by 2 fighter jets, which is the highest honor given by the People's Liberation Army. Now, as I said, many of the Chinese volunteer soldiers, the fallen Chinese volunteer soldiers, were actually buried in the DPRK. Now, and also because talking about these identities of the remains being returned, we spoke with the Ministry of Veteran Affairs earlier this week. They told us up till now 24 names from the 589 returned remains have been verified, and they've already posted some important information about these 24 fallen soldiers on their website, and they were looking for relatives, and they will utilize the resources they have with the media as well as with the general public to help finding the relatives of these 24 identified fallen soldiers. I've been here covering this annual event since 2014, and this is the 6th batch of remains being returned by South Korea. Now, both countries agree to repatriate the remains on humanitarian grounds. And one expert on Korean study told us, he says, both countries are now strategic partners, China and South Korea. The 2 countries respect each other's standpoints on the past. For instance, in China, we call it the war to resist US aggression and aid Korea, whereas in the US and in South Korea, people call it the Korean War. It is fine to respect each other's standpoints, but what really matters is to understand how important peace is on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, I think it's 1 minute countdown. Now, let's take a look at our Mandarin channel. On the Mandarin channel, the anchor is introducing to the audience one of the relatives of the found within the 24 identified fallen soldiers. His name is Zhou Guo, and he's from Henan province. He arrived in Shenyang yesterday, and he is within the first batch of people, relatives. Okay. Sorry, just one moment. We will adjust our camera to make sure we won't interfere their live cross. And okay, I think they are fine. Okay, I will give you a brief intro about the commemoration ceremony today. The plane will be travel from that direction, and this will be the runway, and it will slowly approach to the center of the square. After landing, a convoy from the People's Liberation Army will get on the plane. They will cover the national flags on the coffins and bring them down onto the table. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 tables have been placed. And also the other thing I want to share with you is during the burial ceremony tomorrow in the Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang, we will see 9 coffins for the 10 sets of remains. The reason for that is in Chinese tradition and numerology, 9 is a big figure. People believe that it represents longevity, and also because in Chinese, 9 sounds very similar to the word of everlasting. So, for instance, there are 9,999 rooms in the Forbidden City. So it shows you the kind of respects and the condolences people here have for the burial ceremony. So that's something that I should mention to tell you about. So tomorrow during the burial ceremony, we will see 9 coffins for the 10 sets of soldiers. But today we will see 10 coffins, all will be covered by China's national flag. And it's very, very windy today at Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. And obviously, it's empty square here. Also, from the air controller told us all the flights between now and 11:30 will be postponed just for this special occasion. Okay. We are still waiting. After being returned today, the 10 sets of coffins will be transferred to the Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang, where the previous returns of 589 sets have all been buried here in Shenyang, and there are over 1,200 plots available in the cemetery. So for future returns, so the local authorities, they're prepared thoroughly to make sure the honorable return for the soldiers back to home soil. Okay, I think we are seeing something over here there. That could be the plane. I'm not sure, or it could be a civil aircraft. No, that is not. It's just an ordinary civil aircraft. And also, I have the other thing to show our viewers. Now, what I've got here, these are some of the photos given by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which they have already posted online. These are the remains, of the 24 identified fallen soldiers. We can see some of the personal belongings like uniforms, ammunition, personal letters, okay, the spoon they've used during the battlefield. Now, the name stamp of the soldier. So this belongs, they belongs to the 24 fallen soldiers whose identity have been verified. They are within the previous returns in the past couple of years. Now, this is very touching. Now, we can see this photo here. It clearly shows this is the loved one of the fallen soldiers. It belongs to Yang Shuangxi, a Chinese volunteer soldier, died in 1951. So all these informations have been posted online, and the Ministry of Veteran Affairs told us they will utilize the resources they have with the media, with the general public, and also with other authorities to help find the relatives of these 24 identified fallen soldiers. Also, these are also from our Mandarin channel. They're also doing a live streaming. It is a big event. Speaking of the number of medias have attended today's ceremony, and tomorrow during the burial ceremony, the Mandarin team will also do a full coverage for the burial. Okay, for some of our viewers who just joined our live streaming, the gentleman here, he is one of the relatives of the identified fallen soldiers. Up till now, over 589 sets of remains have been returned. That doesn't include today's return. Among these 589 sets of remains, 24 fallen soldiers, their identities have been verified. And also, it is worth mentioning that after the previous return last year, the newly formed Ministry of Veteran Affairs, following the structural reform of China's State Council, is now taking charge of the relevant work regarding the settlement of remains for the Chinese volunteer soldiers. Now, previously, the jobs were handled by different government bodies like the Ministry of Civil Affairs, the Ministry of Human Resources and the Social Security, and the Central Ministry Commission. Now, the formation of the Ministry of Veteran Affairs shows that the promise made by Chinese President Xi Jinping has been fulfilled, in which President Xi said, "We will establish an administration for veterans to protect the legitimate rights and the interests of military personnel and their family." Okay. It looks like the live has already started on the Mandarin channel. For some of our viewers who might not be familiar with how TV live was produced, so this gives you a clear picture of how the job is done. It takes a lot of work, preparation work beforehand. especially talking about how important today's event really is. And it's very windy here. Very windy here. You can see the hair being blown, the anchor's hair. Okay, it's tight on security today, very tight security to make sure it will be a smooth, very smooth ceremony. Okay, just give you a little bit idea about the surroundings. Over there, that's the terminals for the civil passenger aircrafts. Shenyang Taoxian International Airport is a major transportation hub in China's northeast. You have direct flights to Los Angeles, to Seoul, to Tokyo. Now this area is be reserved, the whole area be reserved just especially for today's event. Okay, now the convoy from the People's Liberation Army, they are getting ready for welcoming the 10 fallen soldiers home. And it will take about 1 hour to transfer the coffin airport to the martyrs cemetery in Shenyang. And we were talking about the new Ministry of Veteran Affairs. It was set up to draft policies and regulations related to demobilize military personnel and then put them into practice, to publicize to the society the achievements made by veterans for the party and the country as well as the people. And the ministry will also deal with issues regarding training and re-employment to support veterans' family members and to handle issues on pension and retirement benefits, as well as to take care of military cemeteries and to organize commemoration activities. Okay, we are still waiting for the plane to land. Well, we often heard viewers asking how many remains returned have been identified. According to the Ministry of Veteran Affairs, they said so far they've found 24 names as well as some very valuable information of the remains returned. So far, 24 sets of remains have been verified. They posted the information regarding these 24 fallen soldiers online to look for their relatives. The Mandarin team, they are doing a live coverage with one of the relatives of the fallen soldiers just now. And the repatriation take place ahead of China's annual Qingming, known as the Tomb Sweeping Day, when people visit and clean the graves of their ancestors. Now in 2013, South Korea started excavating the remains of Chinese soldiers, volunteer soldiers buried at a cemetery in the border city of Paju under the agreement reached with China. Now, these 10 sets of remains, which will be returned today, were excavated between March and November last year. The remains have been washed, dried, and placed in coffins by South Korean side before being returned to China. And the scientists have worked to identify them by analyzing uniforms or ammunition, but often fail to put a name to the fallen soldiers. And because their identities were unknown, people at the ceremony today can only regard them as comrades in arms.
晚了是吧？35现在目前正好是35。你们一会儿是不是得进去啊？
在直播，我在直播。Okay, we've just been told that the plane will land at around 11:30. Around 11:30.
然后等于是对他屁股，然后再由他慢慢往那边走。对他前导车，他车头是不是应该在那边，然后再往这边？那边就完事了。他肯定是从这边过。我先你到往这边，怎么着？我的，没拍着他了。
Now, as I said, we were informed just now that the plane will not land until 11:30, so we have roughly 20 minutes to go for cover the landing. I shall get back to you in about 15 minutes time, and we will cover the whole ceremony from then. We will stay tuned, and we won't be disconnected. We'll just patiently wait. Uh,
他们走的时候车队得搁这儿走啊，你得把这地方让开啊。
往这边俩是吧？往这边俩行不行？这边，这边。
对对对对对。
Okay, let's just. We were informed that we need to clear this way to get some room for the convoy. Wait one moment. Now. Okay, let's get a shot of one of the relatives of the identified fallen soldiers.
把你的机器拿下来，拍下他那个照片。跟着走是吧？好好，我来。
Okay. Now he is holding one of the certificates given by the People's Liberation Army after his family members died during the Korean War, and his name is Joe Bo. He will be in the live coverage for the Mandarin team. 国国际电视台 CGTN 的。您今天带来这个是什么？给我们介绍一下。
这是我大爷爷周少武的烈士证书。
您的大爷爷？
对，我大爷爷。
就是您爷爷的
哥哥。
爷爷的哥哥。This is the certificate as a fallen hero for his the brother of his grandfather who died during the Korean War. 咱们那个就是您的这位这个家人，他是第几批被归还的遗骸？在哪边？
他是第一批啊，然后安葬在沈阳的志愿军烈士陵园。
志愿军陵园。Okay. The remains of the fallen soldiers was which is his family member was returned in 2014 and was buried in the Korean martyrs cemetery in Shenyang. And 你是从哪儿来的？老家在哪里？
我老家是河南省济源市。
He was from Henan province, in the city of 济源。济源是，你什么时候来到沈阳的？这几天什么安排？
我是4月2号来到沈阳。
昨天。这几天会有什么样一个安排呢？
今天就是参加第6批在韩志愿军烈士遗骸回国。明天参加安葬，然后把祭拜。
Okay. He arrived Shenyang yesterday, and he will be here for the whole ceremony, for this morning's returns as well as for tomorrow's burial ceremony. Many viewers were curious that how the missing relatives of these fallen soldiers were found. Let me ask him. 咱们是怎么找到这个线索，联系上就是我们这个失去的联系的亲人的？
这个是3月28号，我们济源市退役军事务局，他们通过相关单位，然后找到我们崔大队部，就是崔居民委员会啊，我这个支书联系到我，然后他们拿着他们的档案，我从家里拿着我大爷爷这个烈士证书，然后核对相关信息，核对完信息完全正确无疑。
Okay. He only just found out just about less than a week ago on the 28th of March. The bureau of the city where he lived, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has informed him that his family member, which is the brother of his grandfather, was actually the remains was being returned on the in 2014, and it was his family member. It's been verified. So Zhou Bo is actually one of the few relatives who actually found their missing one, and they do know now that their loved ones are buried in the martyr cemetery in Shenyang. Okay. 谢谢你 Thank you. Okay, we have more than 10 minutes to go. And it's kind of difficult to make sure all the media at today's event can get a good shot, because there are more than like 100 media people have attended this morning's ceremony. Okay, and also they were running a rehearsal. Okay, the officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were running a rehearsal. Running a rehearsal, giving some introductions and the rules for today's ceremony. He said to turn off your mobile phones and to not get out of the restricted areas. And in terms of the burial service tomorrow, which is Thursday, we spoke to the officials from the Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang, and they told us the cemetery has already completed the renovation and expansion projects, and there are over 1,200 plots available, especially for burial services for the remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers, which are to be returned on a yearly basis by South Korea. And talking about the significance of today's event, the annual returns of volunteer soldiers' remains, over the past 60 years or 66 years since the armistice, we have seen a tremendous amount of work was done in regards to honor wartime Chinese volunteers across the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK, for instance, has built numerous cemeteries for fallen Chinese volunteer soldiers, and the top-ranking officials from China, from DPRK, and South Korea have paid tribute to many of the martyrs on the Korean Peninsula on many occasions. For some of the viewers who have just entered, just see our coverage, let me just give you a brief rundown. This is Shenyang Taoxian International Airport, and we are covering the return of 10 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers who died during the Korean War. A commemoration ceremony will be held at 11:30 this morning, and the plane carrying the remains will be escorted by 2 fighter jets from the People's Liberation Army, the Air Force. This will be a high honor given by the PLA. And after the landing, this special convoy of PLA from the PLA and also a military band will get on the plane. They will cover the coffins with China's national flag and bring them down to the buses. They are getting ready, preparing. It's a great honor for these soldiers to welcome the country's heroes home. It's been 66 years since the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. Up till now, 589 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers had been returned to home soil. This was based on the agreement signed between China and South Korea back in 2013 that South Korea will excavate the remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers on a yearly basis and return the remains just before the tomb sweeping day annually So far, 5 returns. We have seen 5 returns since 2014. And with this one, a total 599 sets of remains are finally back to home soil. More than 2.4 million Chinese volunteer soldiers were sent to the DPRK for the Korean War. And the latest figures show that nearly 20,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers died during the war. But very few of them were actually buried in China and their homeland. This includes Mao Ai-ying, the son of Chairman Mao Zedong. He was buried in the DPRK. And up till now, 24 sets of remains have been identified, and the Ministry of Veteran Affairs has already posted the crucial information regarding these 24 fallen soldiers on their website. Some of the relatives have already been informed by the ministry, and we spoke with Zhou Bo. He is the brother of his grandfather who died during the Korean War, and he is here to witness the return of the fallen soldiers who fought alongside with his family member. And one expert on Korean study told us that he thinks now China and South Korea are now strategic partners. The two countries respect each other's standpoints about the past. In China, we call the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, whereas in South Korea and in the U.S., they refer to it as the Korean War. And he thinks what really matters from today's perspective is to understand how precious peace is. And people in China often take commemoration ceremonies of the war as the opportunity to reflect on the lessons of the war and to cherish the hard-won peace. And some said, if peace is worth dying for, it should also be worth living for. Okay, I think we have 2 minutes to go. The plane was scheduled to land at 11 o'clock this morning, but for some reason, oh, here he come. Now, the 2 fighter jets, I believe, is the J-11 fighter jets. They were escorting the plane ever since he entered China's airspace. This is the highest honor given by the People's Liberation Army. We've seen that in the previous returns. Now, that is the plane. Now we can see that, as far as my eyes can see now, that is the plane carrying the remains of 10 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers who died during the Korean War. It's approaching to the airport. This is the moment for the relatives, for the veterans of the Korean War. This is the moment they've been waiting for more than 6 decades. Ten sets of remains are on board. 10 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers are on board. The remains were carefully washed, dried, and placed in coffins in South Korea before being returned. And there was an exchange ceremony held in South Korea this morning as well. It took about 1 or 2 hours for the plane to travel from South Korea to Shenyang. You can see the plane is a little bit wobbling because it's very windy today in Shenyang. Here he comes. Okay. Okay, touches down to home soil. More than 6 decades since the end of since the armistice of Korean War, 10 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers make an honorable return to home soil. Hold on. Okay, I think we have more fighter jets as the escorts. So it shows the kind of respect the People's Liberation Army have for the fallen soldiers. Okay. Okay, there were plenty of smokes. Okay, it's the way to pay tribute to the fallen soldiers. And over there we can see 10 tables have been placed. Okay, so after landing, the coffins will be covered by China's national flag and are placed on the table. Then officials from the Ministry of Veteran Affairs will deliver a keynote speech. After that, the coffins will be transferred to the martyrs cemetery in Shenyang. Okay, our CCTV Mandarin team is doing a full live coverage for the return. more than 2.4 million Chinese volunteer soldiers were sent to the DPRK in 1950, and the latest figures show that nearly 20,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers died during the war, but very few of them were actually buried in China. Now, after this return, 599 sets of fallen soldiers are buried in China, in Shenyang. So the relatives of the missing fallen soldiers can now go to the cemetery to send their condolences to their family members. Slowly approaching. This is one of the heavy-duty transportation aircraft in the People's Air in the PLA's Air Force. Sixth batch of remains by South Korea since 2013. On that plane we can see it says the Air Force of People's Liberation Army. This is a military transportation aircraft. Very strong wind. Okay. So you can see the convoy from PLA, they were getting ready. They were getting the plane and they carried the coffins of 10 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers down to the ground. we can see that there are 10 tables. 10 tables have been placed on the right carpet. The coffins will be placed on the top of the tables, and then they will be transferred to the buses to the Korean Martyr Cemetery in Shenyang for the burial ceremony tomorrow. And the other thing I want to share with our viewers is that during the burial ceremony tomorrow, we only see 9 coffins for the 10 sets of remains, because based on Chinese customs and numerology, 9 is a big figure. It also sounds similar to the Chinese word of everlasting, which represents longevity. So, for instance, there are 9,999 rooms in the Forbidden City of Beijing. So this is kind of respects and condolences people here have for these 10 fallen Chinese volunteer soldiers. Okay. This is CGTN bringing you live from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. I have to go now because we have to do a live coverage on TV in less than 15 minutes time. So you can turn on your television and check our coverage on our channel for the returns of the 10 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers who died during the Korean War. Yes. And tomorrow we will do more coverage about the burial ceremony for the 6th batch of, for these 10 sets of fallen Chinese volunteer soldiers. So we'll keep you posted. Thanks for watching.